July 1944. The war in Europe was a grinding, agonizing mechanism of fire and steel. Yet, far from the inferno, in the scorched, sun-baked heart of Texas, a bizarre and unfamiliar cargo was arriving. The trains that rumbled across the high plains carried young German women in the drab, heavy uniforms of the Wehrmacht auxiliaries. They were guarded by American soldiers whose faces were leathered by the sun, their eyes quiet and haunted. Among them was 19-year-old Liza Weber. Liza had absorbed the absolute poison of Goebbels' propaganda. She had been taught that Americans were subhuman, brutal, uncultured, and savage toward prisoners. She expected to be spat upon, humiliated, perhaps worse. She rehearsed her grim composure as she stepped down from the rail car, the sweltering Texas heat hitting her like a physical blow. But the expected nightmare dissolved into an absurd and jarring reality. A local man, broad-shouldered beneath a wide Stetson hat, his voice a thick, slow southern drawl, offered her not curses, but a cold drink. His smile was kind, not mocking. Another handed her a lemon-scented handkerchief, treating her like a distressed guest rather than a sworn enemy. She was utterly stunned. The land smelled not of cordite and burning rubble, but of hay and dry dust. The guards were not yelling. The locals along the fence line were simply waving. Liza clutched her canvas bag tighter. She thought she was walking into a living hell. Standing there, boots on dry, alien earth, she began to realize this was not the America she had been warned about, and she was not the only one whose beliefs were about to shatter. Long before she ever saw Texas, Liza had been conditioned to fear it. In the final, desperate years of the Third Reich, the regime's grip on information was absolute. Newsreels depict Americans as depraved monsters, soldiers who danced on corpses, bombed children, and lived in cities ruled by chaos, Jews, and Negroes. In classrooms across Berlin, teachers whispered warnings. If the Allies capture you, they cautioned, they will shoot you, or worse, especially if you're a woman. Liza grew up on ration cards and air raid sirens. By 17, she had already lost 2 brothers on the Eastern Front. She volunteered as a Luftwaffe auxiliary, hoping to serve, perhaps tending to the wounded. Instead, she was stationed near a munition site in France and captured by the Americans just weeks after D-Day. The rumors started immediately aboard the transport ship across the Atlantic. The women were packed below deck, seasick and silent. Someone claimed a French girl had been assaulted by American guards. Another whispered dark tales of prisoners thrown overboard to the endless sea. There was no proof, but fear does not need facts. It thrives on repetition. By the time they reached port in the United States, most of the women had internalized a silent, desperate vow. Obey. Avoid eye contact. Survive. The journey into the American interior was a slow, grinding psychological assault. Every kilometer widened the terrifying gap between the propaganda they'd been fed and the stark reality outside the rattling boxcars. They expected scorched earth, hostile mobs, the crude brutality promised by their officers. Instead, the train to Texas sliced through an impossibly green landscape, endless cornfields, sleepy, sun-drenched towns, and communities that looked impossibly untouched by the war they had left behind. People looked normal. Families waved from neat front porches. Children sprinted alongside the tracks, laughing in careless freedom. An elderly man, utterly without malice, tipped his straw hat. The sight was deeply unnerving. Liesl, pressed against the smoky glass, watched a neighbor hold her baby. Beside her, a young auxiliary named Greta whispered through tears, "Why are they smiling? Don't they know who we are?" There was no adequate answer. Their destination was Camp Hearn, one of the massive prisoner of war installations carved into the American South. Though the camp was primarily designed to house thousands of captured German fighting men, space had been cleared for the small, highly unusual contingent of female auxiliaries. They were not the hardened SS shock troopers of Reich mythology. They were clerks, nurses, telephone operators, administrative cogs assigned to non-combat duties. But they wore the Feldgrau, the uniform of the enemy, and that was enough to condemn them. The gate, framed by razor wire, was chillingly ordinary. A hand-painted sign confirmed the unbelievable. Geneva Convention observed here. Asterisk, it felt like the cruelest kind of theatrical setup. The American guards were impossibly young, fresh-faced boys who seemed genuinely awkward. They didn't shout, they didn't swagger. They carried rifles, yes, but their demeanor was respectful, almost shy. One young private, red-faced with embarrassment, actually stepped forward to help a pale auxiliary hoist her heavy suitcase. Inside the wire, the shock deepened in profound disbelief. The barracks were plain but meticulously clean. There were rules and fences and the constant threat of surveillance, but the terror never materialized. There were no dogs, no punitive beatings, no casual degradation. Instead, there was a small library stocked with actual books, an art studio with fresh oils and canvases, and the sound of a quiet choir rehearsing a hymn near the makeshift chapel. It was order, but married to simple human decency. Liesl found herself staring at the bulletin board beside the mess hall, a daily schedule, posted clearly in both English and German. It listed work details, chapel hours, and then the truly absurd item, movie night, American films. A low, fearful murmur ran through the clustered women. "This is a trick," someone hissed. "A sophisticated psychological operation to break us with kindness." They waited for the mask to slip, for the insults and the starvation to begin. But the pattern never shifted. Day followed day, marked only by quiet routine. The food was strange: syrupy canned peaches, fried eggs, thick sausage, and occasionally sweet pie, but it was plentiful. The young guards offered a respectful nod each morning, sometimes even a hesitant, heavily accented asterisk, "Guten Morgen." Asterisk, no one touched them without explicit consent. Slowly, cautiously, the tension began to drain away. They wrote letters home, spoke without fear of retribution, and then, the ultimate betrayal of their ideological conditioning, they began to laugh again. One warm afternoon, Liesl watched through the wire as a group of American soldiers played horseshoes nearby, their shouts of mild frustration mingling with the lazy, mournful sound of country music drifting from a radio. She turned to her friend, a trace of shame coloring her voice. "I feel guilty saying this," she admitted, watching the sunlight glint off the polished steel of the shoes. "But this doesn't feel like prison at all." Greta didn't need to speak. She only offered a slow, weary smile. The early August air above Mortain was less a landscape and more a butcher's block, thick with the smell of cordite and burning diesel. Lieutenant Carl Hartman, tank commander of the Crusader, braced against the shuddering steel of his Sherman, his eyes narrowed against the glare of artillery fire. This was a furious, desperate counterblow the intelligence staff had feared. The last gas offense of the Germans had chillingly christened Operation Luttich. Their singular, violent objective lay 40 miles west, the vital junction town of Avranches. Inside the deafening heat of the turret, the crew moved with the deadly, precise rhythm of men who understood the stakes. Hard left. We need to traverse now. Hartman yelled, gripping the microphone until his knuckles bleached white. Tony Vitelli, the driver, punished the controls, forcing the Sherman into a precarious hull-down position behind a mound of rubble. Traverse steady. Enemy heavy armor confirmed at 200 meters. Earl Bishop, the gunner, reported, his voice tight but level, his eye fused to the sight. The metallic thunk of a fresh round slamming home followed instantly as James Ortega, the loader, executed the maneuver with brutal efficiency. Fire! The muzzle flash momentarily blinded the crew, followed by the terrible, ripping sound of the high-velocity shell tearing through the air. A German Panther staggered, its turret ringing like a cathedral bell struck by a hammer blow. Hartman knew their position was exposed, and they were drastically outnumbered. Failure here would not simply mean retreat. It meant the collapse of the entire American flank. Losing ground to the spearhead of the panzers could invite severe disciplinary action. There would be no escape from the brutal scrutiny of the post-battle inquiry, nor the crushing weight of a possible court-martial if incompetence were found. Later, if they survived the next 10 minutes, they would spend days meticulously reconstructing this nightmare fight in the official era. But right now, only the immediate present mattered. They had a job to do. Hold Mortain, deny Avranches, survive Operation Luttich. The arrival of these prisoners, German women in full uniform, remained a profound mystery. For the dusty Texas dots on the map, Towns whose residents had never seen a soldier who wasn't American. The detainees became immediate legend. Rumors spread like wildfire across the high plains. Were they fanatics? Dangerous SS agents? Or perhaps, whispered the devout, something akin to witches? But the vast, paralyzing fear of the unknown was quickly eroded by simple, undeniable human curiosity. Local farmers, pulling rusting pickups, slow to crawl outside the fence line. Teenagers, gripped by courage they didn't know they possessed, dared each other to approach the wire. Then came the breach. One humid Sunday afternoon, a teenage boy deliberately lofted a worn baseball over the barbed wire perimeter. He called out a clumsy question in halting German, asking for its return. A moment of silence stretched tautly across the field. Then, a young woman named Marta stepped forward. She retrieved the ball and, instead of defiance, offered a small, hesitant smile as she tossed it back. The boy waved. Marta waved back. That single, fleeting exchange, a simple gesture across an electrified divide, was everything. For Marta, the feeling of being an enemy, a criminal, briefly vanished. By the late summer of 1944, while the desperate German counterattack known as Operation Luttich raged on the roads leading to Avranches, America's farms were collapsing, with every able-bodied man shipped across the Atlantic or the Pacific. The cotton and corn lay rotting under the relentless sun. The War Department, desperate, approved a radical solution, a program to utilize carefully screened enemy prisoners, including the women, as temporary farm labor. The risk was weighed and deemed necessary. And so, just weeks after their capture, German women in olive uniforms began stepping to the gates, not as fugitives, but as temporary farm hands. For the first time, they saw the interior of the nation they were fighting. They rode in battered pickup trucks across fields so wide they seemed to swallow the sky. They walked into vast, creaking barns where static-laced radio music struggled against the low wicker horses. They met the ranchers and widows, the housekeepers and the teenagers left behind. They were watched, yes, but they were also talked to, occasionally teased, and more often than not, treated with bewildering, unexpected element. Kindness. Liesel, stoic and reserved, was assigned to a dairy farm run by an aging couple named Tom and Ruth. They didn't interrogate her about the war. They asked if she wanted lemonade. When she struggled with the complex technique of milking the Jersey cows, Ruth didn't scold. She simply laughed, a kind, rolling sound, and said, "Honey, you'll get it next time." It wasn't friendship. The gulf of the war was too vast for that. But it wasn't hatred, either. That evening, crammed into the back of the truck on a ride back to camp, Liesel watched the Texas sunset paint the horizon in violent strokes of orange and purple fire. Somewhere, thousands of miles behind her, the real war still devoured young men. But here, in this wide, strange, and fundamentally generous land, something deep inside her had shifted. She was still a prisoner. But she no longer felt like a weapon. They were prisoners of war, confined by the rigid codes of the Geneva Convention. But the human heart, unlike a battlefield, rarely follows procedure. In the harsh, blinding heat of rural Texas, a quiet, dangerous chemistry began to brew. Love in the time of barbed wire. The connection started with almost nothing. A quick glance in the back of a canvas-covered truck, a shy nod exchanged across a mile of dusty acreage. The written rules demanded constant supervision, but the sheer, isolating scale of the American heartland was the true warden. Field supervisors, often exhausted or simply indifferent, could not police the vast, stretching distances. Far from the sterile war rooms of Washington and the blasted ruins of Berlin, human nature claimed victory. Marta was the first to admit she'd fallen. Her heavily censored letters, painstakingly reviewed before transit, hinted at a local farmhand, a man called Jay. He was quiet. He sang while he worked, and he risked everything to bring her wild mountain flowers when the shadow of the guard post was long. She didn't know his politics. She only knew his laughter. And for the first time since the war's beginning, she felt untethered, dangerously young. Liesel, too, found herself ensnared. She watched John, the rancher's son. Strong and silent, his hands bore the indelible marks of honest labor. He held none of the swagger or arrogance she had been taught to expect from an American conqueror. They shared no common language. She spoke only broken English. He spoke no German. Yet they found a rhythm. She learned to help with the heavy horses. He taught her the exacting art of mending a fence. He let her ride, just once, when the watchful eyes of his mother were elsewhere. He never used the epithet kraut. She never confessed that she had once prayed for the triumph of the Third Reich. It was a slow, agonizing unraveling of suspicion, the corrosive myths they had internalized. Tales of cruelty, corruption, and inhumanity dissolved with every shared task, every shy, furtive smile. They stopped seeing the symbols of the enemy and started seeing people caught in a global catastrophe they never initiated. But not everyone witnessed this transformation with approval. Local outrage erupted like a flash fire. "Our boys are bleeding overseas," screamed families in town halls, "and these women are having picnics with a defeated enemy." A furious Baptist preacher delivered a damning sermon on the seduction of Christian men by foreign women who had, only months prior, served the ideals of Hitler. Farmers reported neighbors for sheltering the enemy in their barns. The military reacted with a sterile, quiet internal memorandum. Fraternization is strictly discouraged. Yet, enforcement was lethargic, almost non-existent. Why? Because the war machine was exhausted. Every man, from the weary guard on duty to the supervising officer typing up his derriere, was simply tired. Tired of death, tired of the unrelenting weight of fear, tired of pretending that this fractured world adhered to any rational set of rules. So the rigid lines blurred. As the Texas night air cooled and the guards relaxed their vigil, something profound happened. In the vast, dark spaces of barns, deep in secret groves just beyond, behind the coil of perimeter wire, beneath the relentless crush of the Texas night sky, an illicit theater unfolded. These were not official gatherings, but moments of raw, desperate reality. A smuggled radio would hiss to life, spooling out the forbidden, rebellious strains of Glenn Miller. Someone would produce a bottle of stolen Coca-Cola or a handful of precious cigarettes. And under the harsh stars, American farm boys in khaki swayed with German women. Prisoners separated from their nation, but not their humanity. They did not talk politics. They did not speak the brutal dialect of war. They spoke the language of the mundane, of movies, of food, of the beautiful world that had shattered around them. As one woman, Greta, later recorded in her memoir, this brief escape was everything. "I remember dancing in bare feet on the dirt floor of an old shed, my hair unbraided, his hands careful but sure. For 10 minutes. I forgot I was a prisoner. I remembered I was a girl." The system was rigid, built on discipline and division, yet humanity found the cracks. Some guards simply looked the other way, shoulders hunched against the moonlight. Others quietly stood sentinel, not to halt the events, but to protect them. Somehow, everyone understood this was healing, a necessary anesthetic against the chaos. By early 1945, the lines blurred entirely. At least a dozen women in Camp Hearn were believed to be intimately involved with locals, be they guards, farmers, or townsfolk. These were small, fragile things, built on stolen time and forbidden glances, define the entire architecture of the conflict. Rumors swirled, but few were punished. The administration prioritized stability over scandal. One woman was transferred after being caught kissing an American soldier behind the supply shed. Another was quietly reassigned to indoor duties when a rancher's wife accused her of seducing her son, avoiding the need for a potential court-martial investigation. But mostly, they were left alone. When everything else had been taken, their homes, their nations, their futures, these women still possessed hearts. And miraculously, those hearts found others willing to hold them. Then came May 8th, 1945. The world changed with brutal speed. Word of Germany's surrender spread to the camp like a summer fire. The war in Europe was done. For the women at Camp Hearn, it was a moment not of celebration, but profound, suffocating silence. No cheering, no tears, just stillness. They stood frozen in their work clothes, the long dreamed of peace arriving not as liberation, but as a complicated, terrifying uncertainty. They were still prisoners, now facing repatriation to a homeland they barely knew, waiting for letters that arrived fewer and fewer, some never arriving at all. Within days, the inevitable directive arrived. The War Department issued strict instructions. All prisoners would be processed for repatriation. The war had ended, and the hearts, finally, would break. For these women, the war was over, but the wreckage remained. They returned to a nation reduced to ash and shadow, cities gutted, families fragmented. The very ideology that had fueled their service now a pile of smoking ruin. For Liesl, the price of repatriation was immediate and absolute separation. It meant leaving the man who had seen beyond the uniform, leaving John. They met beneath the cotton tree one final time, the quiet spot where silence had first given way to confession. Her German phrase, raw and desperate, asterisk, ich will nicht gehen. Asterisk, I don't want to go. His simple, steady reply, I know. There were no papers, no official seal, only a promise whispered against the sound of distant air traffic. I'll find a way back to you, John vowed. But the cruel geometry of history suggested otherwise. The world had always found a way to tear down what they built. The platform at the railhead was a tableau of quiet grief. Dozens of women, canvas bags at their feet, uniforms folded tight. They stood separated from their American counterparts by an invisible but absolute line. When the air brake hissed and the whistle screamed, Liesl searched the thinning crowd. John was still there, the brim of his hat held in his hand. His eyes held no easy sorrow, and certainly no naive hope. They held the deep, unsettling recognition of a promise suspended between continents. The train pulled away, carrying them toward a welcome far colder than they could imagine. Back on German soil, the homecoming was a brutal shock. Repatriated women were greeted not as survivors, but as suspects. A pervasive atmosphere of contempt shadowed them. Bureaucrats, men who had waited out the war, accused them of complicity, or worse, of surrendering too willingly. You traded your loyalty for soft treatment. One official spat. They were labeled collaborators. Food disappeared. Jobs vanished. They were ghosts in their own towns. But Liesl carried an anchor that the ruined Reich could not confiscate, a crumpled photograph of dusty Texas acreage and the name John Miller. She risked a letter into the void. Months dragged by, punctuated only by silence, until one morning the answer came. He had been fighting for her, navigating the labyrinth of post-war bureaucracy. The instrument of their salvation, the nascent War Bride Act. Though initially designed for the wives of American GIs married in Europe, a little-known legislative loophole allowed former enemy nationals, under extraordinary scrutiny and specific conditions, to return and marry American citizens. It demanded mountains of paperwork, affidavits from John's rancher family, and endless petitions. But in the spring of 1946, the impossible materialized. Liesl boarded another ship. This time, she carried no canvas bag, no uniform. She sailed not as a prisoner, but as a fiancée. She stepped onto the pier in New York, wearing a borrowed coat, clutching the single slip of paper bearing his Texas address. Days later, at a dusty rail station under a high sun, John was waiting. He wore the same battered hat. No words were spoken. The years of war, the miles of ocean, the cruel necessity of separation, all dissolved in that silent, enduring embrace. That summer, they were married. And they were not alone. Across the quiet heartland of America, in Texas, in Iowa, in Georgia, dozens of German women, once enemy nationals, returned not as ghosts of the war, but as builders of a new life. They came back as wives, proving that the deepest promises sometimes survive the widest devastation. By 1950, the impossible had begun to happen. Over 200 former German military personnel and civilians, women and men, had legally crossed the Atlantic once more. They arrived not as invaders, but as immigrants, sponsored by the very Americans who had once stood watch over them. Former jailers, former employers, and, startlingly often, former lovers. In towns like Hearne, Texas, acceptance was a hard-fought battle waged on back porches and in grocery aisles. Neighbors whispered the word enemy, until they realized she worked harder than they did, until they watched her smile through the suspicion, until they tasted the bread she baked. A dark, dense loaf that tasted of resilience. John Miller, the man who brought her home, was guarded about their wartime history. He simply stated that Liza was a gift salvaged from a conflict that had taken everything else. But not all stories found such a fragile peace. Some women who returned were swallowed by silence. Others divorced quickly, finding the cultural gulf impossible to bridge. Yet for those who made it, who anchored themselves in the dusty quiet of the American heartland, something profound was occurring. They were not merely survivors. They were living, breathing proof that the deepest lines drawn by the bloodiest war in history could still be erased by human connection. They had transitioned from enemy combatants to Texans. On paper, they might never be fully American, bound by bureaucracy and lingering memory, but in spirit, in the quiet, unrelenting routines of rural life. In the pies cooling on windowsills the babies raised and the German lullabies hummed while folding laundry, they became something unique, settlers of a new, strange peace. Liza and John built their future on the edge of his father's ranch, a 2-room shack with a wood stove and a worn porch swing. Liza tried to plant sunflowers, a vibrant splash of memory, but the arid Texas soil choked them at first. She learned to mend John's heavy denim instead of mending uniforms. Her accent, crisp and clear, never surrendered, but the judgment surrounding it slowly faded. The war remained a fresh wound. Newspapers still carried stories of Nuremberg. The word German still caused immediate scrutiny. At church, some parishioners left a pew vacant around her. One woman famously crossed the street to avoid Liza's path. But time, that most persistent of forces, erodes even the hardest granite of hate. Liza volunteered at the local schoolhouse. She taught the children to count in German. She knitted prayer shawls for the church raffle. She baked perfect, flaky strudels for county fairs. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the town stopped seeing that German girl. She became Miss Liza, then Mrs. Miller, then simply one of their own. She was not alone in this improbable journey. In Austin, another former prisoner named Greta opened a small cafe with her American husband. The walls were painted sky blue, and the menu defiantly listed schnitzel right beside chili. Her daughter spoke English with an unmistakable Texas twang, and learned to say grace before dinner, a custom Greta had once found alien, almost primitive. Another, Annalise, married a widowed preacher, trading her past identity for the mantle of Sunday school teacher. The enemy had become the neighbor. The prisoners had become pioneers. The irony was a cold, sharp blade. These women, once uniformed auxiliaries to the Reich, now moved among American towns, binding the wounds of the very soldiers who had once guarded them in captivity. We were taught to fear them, one admitted years later, her voice still carrying the whisper of a foreign accent. Now they trust me with their children. It was the ultimate, shattering paradox of peace. The journey was paved with landmines of memory and suspicion. Not all the fragile alliances survived the pressure cooker of post-war small-town America. Some marriages fractured, buckling beneath the weight of whispered rumors and old hostilities, and a few women slipped quietly back across the Atlantic, returning to a West Germany that was already rebuilding and forgetting. But the majority stood firm. They stayed not out of obligation, but out of absolute, defiant conviction. They had crossed the cultural frontier, and they chose to hold the new ground. By the 1960s, a new generation walked the earth of Texas. These were the children of the enemy and the victor, melding the bloodlines of 2 continents. They wore American high school jerseys, played football under Friday night lights, and marched proudly in 4th of July parades. The ultimate, stunning testament to this strange peace. One of Liza's own sons would eventually trade his Texas boots for jungle fatigues, serving the United States Army in the brutal fields of Vietnam. Liza Miller kept her history sequestered in a small cedar box beneath her bed, a folded, pristine uniform, the ghost of the old life, next to a pressed flower from the day she met John and a worn, brittle ticket stub from her repatriation train ride of 1945. Evidence of the 3 distinct lives she had lived. The soldier, the prisoner, the wife. She never spoke with bitterness about the country she had left behind. But when pressed, did she miss the forest, the history, the language? She would offer a simple, profound truth, delivered with a slow, certain smile No one offers you lemonade on a train in Berlin. Over the decades, the town forgot the specifics, which farm, which guard, which camp, but they remembered the feeling that somehow, despite the wreckage of the world, something impossibly beautiful had grown. Time, the great silent warrior, finally claimed John Miller. At the funeral, Liesel sat front and center, a sentinel of memory. The local pastor, a man too young to remember the echo of the war, spoke only once of strange history that bound them. Later that evening, the fierce Texas sun bled out behind the scrub oaks. Liesel sat alone on the porch swing, the cicadas thrumming their ancient song. She looked out over the field, the same dusty stretch where she had once picked cotton as a captive, where she had fallen in love as a free woman, and she whispered a final declaration into the silence, a truth stronger than any AR or court-martial verdict. I came here as a prisoner, but I was set free. Time, ruthless and relentless, accomplished what the war never could. It softened the edges of history. It blurred the distinction between the uniform of the enemy and the uniform of the husband. It carried old soldiers and improbable lovers into a common silence. Liesel Miller lived a long life. She outlived John, outlived her siblings, outlived the memory of the conflict itself. But she never left Texas. She never stopped baking the heavy rye bread that smelled of the old country, never stopped hanging laundry in the dry, sharp breeze, never stopped humming the low, drifting lullabies, ghosts of a past that had somehow, impossibly, paved the way for the future. For decades, the war existed for Liesel only as a ghost, a presence banished to the back of the mind. The silence she kept was not born of secrecy, but of profound exhaustion. The conflict, she believed, had already taken enough. But as her life approached its final, quiet chapter, her granddaughter, Anna, posed the unavoidable question. Where are you really from? Liesel did not answer verbally. Instead, she offered a single, aged document, a letter dated July 3rd, 1995. The ink held a confession of a lifetime. You asked me why I never went back, she wrote. I did, in dreams and letters, in the terrible sound of trains. I left Berlin a girl trained to believe the enemy was a monster without a soul. I arrived in Texas, still wearing that fear like a soldier's tunic. But America forced me to take it off. Not all at once, but in pieces. With every offered bowl of stew, every simple glass of lemonade replacing the promise of a rifle, I found my peace. It taught me a terrible truth. The enemy smiles, too. Liesel passed later that year. Her funeral was attended not just by neighbors and old church friends, but by 3 former guards from Camp Hearn, men who had once been her jailers. They stood alongside those who remembered the persistent, fading whispers of her past. Her gravestone became her final statement, a declaration etched in stone. Born in Berlin, died in Brenham. Loved both. Tucked into the spine of a dusty photo album is a snapshot from 1946. A German girl in a plain cotton dress stands beside a tall Texan in a cowboy hat. They are not posing. They are simply, profoundly smiling. She had arrived on American soil in the chains of war. She stayed because of love. In that choice, Liesel rewrote the definition of enemy, not with speeches, revolutions, or mass movements, but with the quiet, devastating power of choosing to stay. Because sometimes, history does not end with an official treaty or a detailed AR. Sometimes, it ends with a wedding ring. This is the most unexpected chapter of World War II. It involved no armored thrusts, no desperate combat, and certainly no need for a court-martial. It involved dinner tables, front porches, and broken people finding wholeness in the country they were once compelled to fear. In total, over 400,000 German prisoners were held in the United States. While the vast majority were men, a few hundred women, auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, shared their fate. Most returned, but a handful remained. Not forced, but chosen. They fell in love not just with people, but with an idea. The idea that your enemy can become your neighbor. And that forgiveness, though painstakingly slow, is always profoundly possible.